Hello, my name is Jane. Welcome to Sleep Stories World. 500 years before Columbus set sail, a red-haired Norse exile stood on the shore of Greenland and looked west. What he saw, and what his son Leif did about it, is one of the most extraordinary true stories in the history of human exploration. Tonight, we'll follow the Vikings from the longships of Norway, across the ice of the North Atlantic, all the way to the shores of North America, in a gentle, unhurried journey through one of history's greatest adventures, told exactly as the ancient sagas recorded it. So settle in, and let the story carry you. But first, let's prepare your space for rest. Ensure you're somewhere comfortably cool, dark, and quiet. If you need to adjust anything, your curtains, your temperature, your pillows, please do so now. When you're ready, lie down and let yourself settle into your bed. Feel the weight of your body being supported. You may want to cover yourself with a light blanket as your body relaxes. Now, gently close your eyes. There's nothing you need to see anymore tonight. Your only task now is to be here, allowing yourself to receive the gift of rest. Take a deep breath in through your nose. And exhale slowly through your mouth. Breathe in deeply, feeling your chest expand. Breathe out, feeling your body sink deeper into your bed. In. And out. With each breath, you're signaling to your body that it's safe to rest. Now, imagine being surrounded by a warm, vibrant light. This light is gentle and comforting, carrying with it a deep sense of peace and safety. As you breathe in, let this warm light fill your chest. As you breathe out, imagine it spreading gently through your upper body. Breathe in, and let the light expand through your shoulders, your arms, your back. Breathe out, and feel it filling your stomach, your neck, your head, every space within you glowing softly. If a thought comes by, acknowledge it like watching a leaf float by on a gentle stream, and then let it drift away. There will be time for those thoughts later. Now is for rest. On your next breath in, let the warm light travel downward. Feel it reach your hips, your thighs, your knees. Breathe out, and sense it flowing down to your ankles, to your toes. Every part of you now is surrounded by this gentle, warm glow. You are completely enveloped in comfort and peace. Focus on your breath and the warm light surrounding you. If your mind wanders, simply guide it back, gently, to your breath, to the light. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are exactly where you need to be. As we move into tonight's story, allow yourself to let go even more. Let the words wash over you like a gentle tide. You don't need to follow every detail. Simply receive the story as a gift, a soft companion as you journey toward sleep. And now, let us begin. Tonight, we begin a slow journey back through time, across cold and shimmering water, to a world of ice and iron and extraordinary courage. A story that stretches from the rocky shores of Norway all the way to a continent that the rest of the known world would not discover for another 500 years. It is the story of the Norsemen, and it begins, as all great Norse stories do, with a ship. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing on a grey pebbled beach somewhere on the western coast of Norway. The year is somewhere around the 9th century. The air smells of salt and pine resin and cold. The sky above you is vast and pale, washed with the faint rose of early morning light. And there, pulled up onto the shore before you, is a vessel unlike anything you have ever seen. She is long and low and elegant, perhaps 25 meters from stem to stern, built with a kind of fierce, careful beauty that speaks of a people who understood the sea the way others understood the land. Her hull is made of overlapping oak planks, each one hewn by hand and fitted edge over edge in the technique that shipwrights of later centuries would call clinker-built. The planks are fastened with iron rivets and sealed with moss and animal hair soaked in pine tar, and the result is a hull that does not sit rigid in the water but flexes, bending and twisting with the movement of the waves, absorbing the force of the ocean rather than fighting it. This, the Norse shipbuilder understood, was the secret. Not to resist the sea, but to move with it. Her draft, the depth she sits below the waterline, is barely a meter, perhaps less. She could sail the open ocean, crossing hundreds of miles of grey Atlantic swells. But she could also glide up into the shallow mouths of rivers, sailing deep into the interior of foreign lands before the people there had any warning she was coming. She was built for both worlds. That was her genius. Let your breathing slow a little more now. In and out. Amidships, a single square sail hangs from a great crossbeam, the yard, and the sail itself is woven from coarse wool, often dyed in broad stripes of red and cream or brown and white. In a good wind, this sail alone could drive the ship at perhaps 10 or 12 knots, fast enough to cross the open ocean between Norway and Iceland in less than a week, given favorable weather. But when the wind failed, or when precision mattered, threading a river mouth, entering a harbor, approaching a coast in silence, the crew would ship their oars. On either side of the hull, rowing benches ran the length of the vessel, and 15, 20, 30 men would bend their backs in unison, the great oars rising and falling in long, slow strokes, the ship pressing forward with a quiet, rhythmic power. Along the outer flanks of the ship, hung just below the rail on both sides, were the shields. Round, wooden, often painted, each one the property of one of the warriors aboard. In the sagas and in the carved images that survive, the shields hang overlapping one another along the hull like the scales of some enormous serpent, and they were indeed partly practical, protecting the rowers from spray and from enemy arrows, and partly a declaration. Here we are. Here we come. At the stern, the rear of the ship, a single long oar was mounted not in the center, like a modern rudder, but on the right side of the hull. The Norse called it the styrboard, the steering board. And when ships began to dock with the steering board away from the quay, to protect it from damage, they would moor with the left side, the larboard or loading side, against the dock. The right side, the steering side, became simply starboard. We still use that word today, aboard every ship and every aircraft on Earth, an echo of a Norse shipwright's practical decision, 1200 years ago. Rest now. Let your body sink a little deeper. And at the prow, the very front of the ship, was the figurehead. Carved from a single piece of oak or pine, it rose up from the hull like a living thing, a dragon, perhaps, or a great serpent, or the stylized head of some terrible beast, its mouth open, its eyes blank and fierce. These carvings were not merely decorative. The Norse believed the open sea was full of spirits, not all of them friendly, and the figurehead was placed there to frighten the spirits away. When a Norse ship approached land, its own land, the figurehead was sometimes removed, because you did not want to frighten the spirits of your own home. But on the open ocean, or approaching a foreign shore, the carved beast remained, staring forward into the unknown. The people who built these ships, and sailed them, came from the lands we now call Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The Norse, or, as they became known across the frightened coasts of Europe, the Vikings. The word Viking itself may come from the Old Norse vik, a bay or inlet, or perhaps from the verb vikja, to turn aside, to go off on an expedition. A Viking was, at its root, someone who went out raiding or exploring. Not a people. An activity. A calling. And what a world they went out into. From their homelands, the Norse sailed in every direction the compass could point. Eastward, through the Baltic Sea, into the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, following the Volga and the Dnieper all the way down to Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, where Norse warriors, called Varangians, became the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor himself. Southward, through the Mediterranean, to Sicily and the coast of North Africa. Westward and northward, into the grey and dangerous waters of the North Sea and the North Atlantic, to the Orkney Islands, the Shetlands, the Faroe Islands, to the shores of Ireland and Scotland. And southward again, into the great river mouths of France and England, rowing their shallow-drafted longships deep into the interior of kingdoms that had no idea they were coming. Normandy. The name itself means land of the Northmen. The Norse settled it so thoroughly that their duke became a vassal of the French king, and within a century and a half, that duke's descendant, William, would cross the Channel and conquer England. In Ireland, the Norse founded cities. Dublin, Waterford, Limerick. These were Norse trading towns before they were Irish ones. In Sicily, Norse adventurers eventually became kings. The reach of these people, in their flexible oak ships with their woolen sails and their carved dragon prows, was extraordinary, and for the kingdoms and monasteries of Western Europe, their arrival was often terrifying. Let the images settle around you now, like something half-remembered from a dream. The year is 793 AD. The 8th of June. On a narrow tidal island off the northeast coast of England, a place called Lindisfarne, there was a monastery. It was old, and gentle, and very famous. Monks had lived there since the 7th century, copying manuscripts, creating illuminated gospels of breathtaking beauty, praying, and tending their small gardens beside the cold grey North Sea. On that morning in June, ships appeared. Long, low ships, with carved prows. They moved fast, driven by sail and oar, and they came ashore with an efficiency and a violence that the monks had no frame of reference to understand. What happened that day was recorded, in careful and horrified Latin, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The chroniclers wrote of heathen men who came from across the sea, men who miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne. They killed some of the monks. They enslaved others. They took the altar silver, the gospel books with their gold and jeweled covers, the chalices, the candlesticks, the accumulated sacred wealth of a century of devotion. And then they went back to their ships and sailed away. The scholar Alcuin of York, one of the great intellectuals of the age, wrote to the king of Northumbria in anguish. He could not understand it. Never before, he wrote, Has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race? It was, historians now say, the event that announced the Viking Age to the rest of Europe. But for the Norse themselves, it was simply one raid among hundreds, one morning's work on a world that was, from their perspective, rich with possibility and waiting to be explored. Let your breath slow now, and your thoughts drift like a ship moving gently on a calm tide. The age of the Vikings had begun, and from the longships and the raids and the settlements and the far-reaching voyages, something extraordinary would eventually come, a chain of journeys, each one reaching a little further west than the last, until one autumn morning, on an unknown shore somewhere in North America, a Norse sailor became the first European to set foot on a continent that the rest of the world would not find for another 5 centuries. But that story begins in Iceland, and it begins with a man named Erik. We will find him, in time. For now, let the grey sea carry you gently forward, and rest. The world is quiet now. Let the sound of the sea find you, that slow, breathing rhythm of water against stone. Let it carry you. We continue our story after the beginning of the Viking Age, with the longships of the Norse reaching outward across every sea they could find, east to the rivers of Russia, south to the Mediterranean, west to the coasts of Britain and Ireland. Raiders, traders, settlers. A people of extraordinary restlessness and skill, sailing in their flexible oak ships to the farthest edges of the known world. But the story we are following tonight moves westward, always westward, into colder water, into fog and ice and Atlantic swells, toward a continent no European had yet imagined. And the first step on that long westward journey was an island of fire and ice, sitting alone in the North Atlantic, just below the Arctic Circle. Iceland. Let your body settle now, heavy and comfortable. To understand why the Norse went to Iceland, you have to understand what was happening at home. In the second half of the 9th century, a remarkable and ruthless man was in the process of doing something that had never been done before in Scandinavia. His name was Harald, and history would call him Harald Halfagre, Harald Fairhair. For much of the 9th century, Norway had not been one kingdom but many, a mosaic of small territories, each governed by its own jarl or petty king, each fiercely proud of its independence. Harald, who came to power in the 860s or 870s, set out to change that. Through a long series of wars, alliances, marriages and, when necessary, brutal suppression, he unified these fractious territories under a single crown. His own. The Battle of Hafrsfjord, fought somewhere around 872 AD in a fjord near what is now the city of Stavanger, is traditionally remembered as the decisive moment, the battle in which the last serious coalition of rival chieftains was broken, and Norway became, for the first time, a unified kingdom under one king. For Harald, it was a triumph. For many of the chieftains he had defeated, men of proud lineage and fierce independence, men who had spent their entire lives as rulers in their own right, it was intolerable. They would not bend the knee. They would not pay tribute to a king they had tried to resist. And so, rather than submit, they left. Some went south, to the Norse settlements already established in Ireland and Scotland. Some went to the Orkney and Shetland Islands. And some, the ones who mattered most for our story, went west, into the open Atlantic, toward a land they had been hearing rumors about for the better part of a generation. The Norse had not always known about Iceland, but they had known about it for some time before the first settlers arrived. The island had not been entirely empty before the Norse came. Irish monks, hermit scholars who sought out the most remote and isolated places they could find, the better to pray in solitude, had been visiting Iceland, and perhaps living there seasonally, since at least the early 9th century. The Norse called these monks papa, the fathers, and when the first Norse settlers arrived, they found traces of them. Small stone cells, fragments of Irish metalwork, crosses scratched into rock. The monks themselves, it seems, had already departed, perhaps unsettled by the news that the pagans were coming. As early as around 860 AD, a Norse sailor named Nadard, described in later sources as a Viking who had nowhere else to go, having made himself unwelcome in Norway, was sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands when he was blown severely off course to the northwest. He found a large, mountainous island, climbed one of its peaks to look for signs of habitation, saw none, and sailed away. As he left, it began to snow heavily. He called the place Snaeland, Snowland. The name did not stick, but the knowledge of the island did. A few years later, another Norse sailor named Gerar Svaversson circumnavigated the island and confirmed it was indeed an island, not a peninsula of some larger landmass. He wintered there, and when he left he called it Gerarshólmur, Geraris Isle, in the modest tradition of naming things after oneself. But it was a third man who gave the island the name it carries to this day. His name was Rafnar Floki, Floki of the Ravens, and his voyage to Iceland, somewhere around 868 AD, is one of the more charming stories in the history of Norse exploration. Floki was the first person to make a deliberate, planned voyage to this island in the North Atlantic. He knew roughly where it was. What he did not have, of course, was a compass. The magnetic compass would not reach northern Europe for several more centuries. So Floki brought ravens. At each stage of his westward journey, he released a raven. The first raven, when released, circled the ship and flew back the way they had come, back toward the Faroe Islands, which were closer behind them than any land ahead. The second raven circled, found nothing, and returned to the ship. But the third raven, when Floki released it, flew straight ahead, northwest into the open ocean, and did not return. Where a raven flies and does not return, there is land. Floki followed it. He found the island. He settled there for a winter, in a fjord on the northwest coast. The fishing was so good, the sagas tell us, that Floki and his companions spent the entire summer fishing, and entirely failed to make hay for their livestock. The animals died in the cold. And that winter, Floki climbed to high ground and looked north into a fjord filled, from shore to shore, with great floating chunks of sea ice, drifting down from the Arctic. He was not charmed. He called the place Island, Iceland. And Iceland it has remained. Rest now. Let your breathing deepen. The cold air of the North Atlantic, sharp and clean. Despite Floki's unhappy winter, others were listening to the stories coming back from the west. And in the year 874 AD, a date preserved with unusual precision in the Norse historical record, a man named Ingolfur Arnason sailed from Norway with his family, his livestock, his household, and his intention to stay. Ingolfur was a Norse chieftain, and the tradition of how he chose where to settle on this new island is one of those details from the sagas that lodges in the memory and refuses to leave. As his ship approached the coast of Iceland, Ingolfur did what a devout Norse settler would do at a moment of such importance. He took his Ondvegisjulor, his high seat pillars, the ornately carved wooden posts that stood beside the chieftain's seat in any Norse great hall, the most sacred objects a Norse household possessed, and he threw them into the sea. He would build his new home wherever the gods chose to bring them ashore. It took 3 years. His thralls, his slaves, searched the coastline for 3 years before they found the pillars, washed up in a sheltered bay on the southwest coast of the island. The bay was warm with geothermal heat, its waters steaming gently in the cold air. Ingolfur called it Reykjavik, the Bay of Smokes. It is the capital of Iceland today. Its oldest street, Alstrati, runs along the ridge where Ingolfur built his longhouse. The city of Reykjavik grew, over 12 centuries, from the spot where a Norse chieftain followed his carved wooden pillars to shore. Over the decades that followed, more and more settlers came. The exodus from Norway under Harald Fairhair filled ship after ship with families, chieftains, farmers, skilled craftsmen, poets, lawmen, and their households, all of them heading west, all of them looking for a place where they could live by their own rules, under no king's authority. By the time settlement was essentially complete, perhaps 60 years after Ingolfur arrived, Iceland had a population of somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people. We know a remarkable amount about who they were, because at some point, probably in the 12th century, though recording a tradition that was centuries old, Icelandic scholars compiled a document called the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of European colonization. It records, by name and lineage and geography, more than 400 original settler families, and approximately 3,500 named individuals. It tells you where each settler came from, which land they claimed, and who their descendants were. For many of those families, the Landnámabók traces the genealogy forward through generations, into the historical period of the sagas. It is part census, part land registry, part genealogy, and part national epic, and it remains, to this day, one of the primary sources for understanding the settlement of Iceland. The settlers came predominantly from Norway, but the Landnámabók also records a significant number of Norse-Irish settlers, men and women who had been living in the Norse colonies in Ireland and Scotland, and who brought with them Celtic thralls and servants, and Celtic wives. The genetic record of Iceland, which has been studied in remarkable detail in recent decades, confirms this. Modern Icelanders carry a notable proportion of Celtic ancestry, particularly on the maternal line, the legacy of those Irish and Scottish women who came to Iceland in the longships of the 9th century. Let your thoughts drift now, like embers floating up from a fire. The land they had come to was like nowhere else on earth. Iceland sits directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge, the great fissure in the ocean floor where the Eurasian and North American tectonic plates are slowly, year by year, pulling apart. The island is young, geologically speaking, and it shows. Volcanoes rise from its interior, erupting regularly, laying down new fields of black lava that cool into extraordinary formations, twisted columns and frozen waves of stone. Geysers burst from the ground in jets of boiling water. Hot springs bubble in valleys where sheep graze calmly in the steam. The northern lights, the Norwegians, paint the winter sky in curtains of green and violet. Glacier creep down from the highland interior. Rivers run black with volcanic sediment. And everywhere, the grass, for Iceland, despite its name, is extraordinarily green in summer, stretches across the lowland plains in a vivid, almost electric emerald. There were no trees to speak of. The birch and rowan that had once covered parts of the island were quickly cleared by the settlers for timber and fuel, a loss the land would not recover from. But there was rich grazing, extraordinary fishing, seabirds beyond counting, and, critically, no dangerous animals, no rival human populations, no one to fight. For the Norse chieftains who had fled the unification of Norway, it was, in a very real sense, the freedom they had been looking for. They built a society. They brought their laws with them, the Norse legal tradition, the ing, the assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes and make decisions together. And in the year 930 AD, just 56 years after Ingolfur Arnason threw his high seat pillars into the sea, the settlers of Iceland established the Alþingi, the Althing, an annual assembly held each midsummer at a great plain called Ingvellir, the Parliament Plains, where the geological rift between the tectonic plates was literally, visibly present in the landscape, a long crack running through the earth as if the island was slowly being pulled in two. The Althing is considered one of the oldest parliaments in the world. Chieftains came from every corner of Iceland. Laws were recited from memory by a man called the law speaker. Disputes were settled. Marriages were arranged. Goods were traded. Poets competed. News was exchanged. It was, in its own rough-hewn way, a functioning democracy, remarkable for the 10th century, remarkable for any century. Iceland traded with Scandinavia and with the Norse settlements in Britain and Ireland, sending wool, fish, sulfur, falcons, and walrus ivory in exchange for timber, grain, and the metalwork the island could not produce for itself. It developed a literary culture of extraordinary richness. The sagas, those long, spare, deeply human narratives of Norse life and adventure, were composed in Iceland, written down by Icelandic scholars in the 12th and 13th centuries from oral traditions that stretched back to the age of settlement. Two of those sagas matter most for the story we are telling tonight. The Grönlandinga Saga, the Saga of the Greenlanders, and the Eirik Saga Raua, the Saga of Erik the Red. These two texts, composed centuries after the events they describe, are the primary sources for what happened next. And what happened next is the reason we are here, tonight, on this slow journey westward through the dark. Iceland had become a thriving, stable, confident society, a launching pad, as it turned out, for something no one had planned. In the year 982 AD, a man arrived in Iceland from Norway. His name was Thorvald Asvaldsson, and he brought with him his son. His son was a large, strong, red-haired young man with a temper to match his coloring. His name was Erik. And from the high mountains of western Iceland, on a clear day, you could see, just at the edge of the world, the faint dark outline of land. Land to the west, 180 miles away. Land that no Norse eye had ever closely seen. Rest now. Let the story settle around you like a warm blanket, like the smell of wood smoke and the sound of a distant sea. We will follow Erik westward next. For now, let Iceland hold you, its green valleys and its smoking springs, its parliament on the rift between two worlds, its 1,000 ships and its 3,000 named settlers and its great book of beginnings. Sleep is close now. Let it come. Let the world grow quiet. Feel the weight of your body, the warmth around you. There is nothing to carry tonight. Only this, a slow journey on cold water, following a red-haired man into the unknown. We are in Iceland, now. The year is somewhere in the late 9th century. The island has been settled for a generation or two. The longhouses are built, the fields are enclosed, the Althing meets each summer on its great volcanic plain. Iceland has become, against all reasonable expectation, a place of law and language and community, perched at the edge of the habitable world. And into this world, from Norway, comes a man named Thorvald Asvaldsson. Thorvald did not come to Iceland by choice. He came because he had no choice. Back in Norway, he had killed a man. The details are lost, the sagas are vague on this point, but a killing it was, and a killing that could not be easily settled or paid for, and so Thorvald took his household and his livestock and his son and he sailed west, to Iceland, to start again. His son was young when they made that voyage. Young, and large, and red-haired, and watching everything. His name was Erik. Let your breathing slow now. We know more about Erik than we know about most people of the 10th century, because the Icelanders were, among other things, the most assiduous record keepers of the Norse world. The sagas preserved him, imperfectly, at times contradictorily, but vividly. And the picture that emerges from the sagas of Erik Thorvaldsson is of a man who was, in almost every respect, larger than ordinary life. He was physically large. The sagas describe him as powerfully built. He had red hair, the kind of vivid, copper and flame red that drew the eye from across a room, or across a field. And it was this red hair that gave him his epithet. He was Erik Erik the Red. Though some who knew him, the sagas hint, felt the name suited his temperament at least as well as his coloring. Because Erik had his father's problem with killing. After Thorvald died, Erik inherited what land the family had in Iceland and married a woman named Thjodhild, whose family had some standing in Iceland. He settled in a valley called Haukadal, in the western part of the island, and built his farm there. He had children. He had cattle. He had, for a time, something resembling a quiet life. It did not last. One of his neighbors owned slaves, thralls, who, through what the saga describes as an accident or a fight, caused a landslide that destroyed part of Erik's farm. Erik, in the tradition of a man who did not absorb insults passively, killed the thralls. The neighbor, a man named Valgard, or in some versions of the saga, Eyjolf, was unhappy about this, as people tend to be when their property is destroyed. Words were exchanged. The situation escalated, as situations involving Erik tended to do, and before long Erik had killed not only the thralls but also 2 of Valgard's kinsmen. This was serious. By the legal standards of the Althing, Erik was now a man with blood debts outstanding, and enemies making claims against him. He was forced to move, relocated to an island off the coast where he hoped the distance might cool things down. He lent some carved wooden boards, high-seat pillars, in fact, fine and valuable, to a man named Thorgest who lived on the mainland. When Erik asked for them back, Thorgest refused to return them. Erik went and took them. Thorgest came after him. In the fighting that followed, 2 of Thorgest's sons were killed, along with several other men. The valley had been quiet for long enough. The killing had reached a point that could not be overlooked, and Erik's enemies brought the matter to the Althing. The Althing's judgment, handed down somewhere around the year 982 AD, was this: Erik Thorvaldsson, called the Red, was sentenced to Skogenga. Outlawry. He was to be banished from Iceland for a period of 3 years. Any man who sheltered him or aided him during that period acted outside the law. If he remained in Iceland after the sentence was passed, he could be killed without legal consequence. Erik had to go. Rest now. Let your thoughts settle like sediment in still water. But here is the thing about Erik. Here is the quality that separates the merely violent from the genuinely extraordinary. He did not simply wait out his exile on some small island, surviving, enduring, counting the days until he could go home. He used it. He had been hearing, for years, a story that circulated among the sailors and fishermen of western Iceland. Decades earlier, probably sometime in the 930s, a Norse sailor named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson had been sailing from Norway to Iceland when he was blown severely off course, far to the west. Through the mist and the swells, he had glimpsed something. Rocks, first, a scattering of small islands that would come to be called Gumbjarnaska, Gumbjornskerries. And beyond them, through the weather, the dark shape of a coastline. He had not gone closer. He had turned his ship around and found his way back to Iceland, and told his story. But the story sat in the memory of the Western Icelanders, as stories do. And from the high mountains above the western fjords of Iceland, on certain rare and exceptional days of clear weather, it was possible to see it for yourself. Not land in detail, not trees or cliffs or beaches, but a shadow at the edge of the world, a darkening of the horizon to the west-northwest, 180 miles away across cold grey water. Land. Unvisited. Unnamed. Waiting. Erik sailed toward it in 982 AD, in the first year of his exile. He had a ship, a crew, and 3 years in which he had nothing else to do. What he found, when he reached the coastline to the west, was not welcoming. The eastern coast of this enormous island, and it was enormous, far larger than Iceland, was a wall of ice. Glacier descended directly into the sea in towering white cliffs. The pack ice lay thick and impenetrable along the shore, grinding and shifting in the current. There was no beach to land on, no fjord to enter, no sign that anything could live here. It was beautiful, in the way that impossible things are beautiful, vast and white and absolute. But it was not a place for people. Erik sailed south, following the coastline, looking for a way in. He rounded the great southern cape of the island, a place that would eventually be called Cape Farewell, and the name feels earned, and turned north again, up the western side. And here everything changed. Let your breathing slow a little more. Feel the cold air, the wide grey sky. The western coast of this land was different in almost every way from the eastern coast. The ice retreated. Fjords opened, long, deep, sheltered inlets running far into the interior, their walls rising in cliffs of dark rock threaded with green. And in those fjords, at the water's edge and on the lower slopes, there was grass. Real grass. Rich, summer-green grass of the kind that Norse farmers, looking at it with the experienced eye of people who raised cattle and sheep, would immediately recognize as good grazing land. There were rivers running clear and cold from the interior, full of Arctic char and salmon. There were seals on the rocks, and walrus in the shallower bays, and seabirds beyond counting on every cliff face. There was driftwood, timber, always precious to the Norse, washed in by the currents from the forests of Siberia and North America. For 3 years, Erik explored. He sailed up the western fjords, naming the features he found, names that survive in the Icelandic sources. He wintered there, perhaps more than once. He mapped the coastline in his memory, noting the best harbors, the best grazing, the best landing places. He was doing, with the thoroughness of a man who intended to return, what any competent Norse explorer did with new land, assessing it, reading it, deciding what it was worth. And he made a decision about its name. When Erik returned to Iceland, his 3 years of exile complete, he had a proposition to make to his countrymen. He had found a new land, to the west. It was large. It had good grazing. It had rich waters and abundant game and sheltered fjords. A man could make a life there. He called it Greenland. Greenland. The sagas are admirably candid about his reasoning. It was recorded, with a certain dry Norse humor, that Erik believed men would be more readily persuaded to go there if the land had an attractive name. The eastern coast, that wall of ice, those grinding glacier, he said nothing about. He talked about the green fjords, the summer grass, the clear rivers. He called it Greenland. And it worked. Rest now. Let the story breathe around you. In the summer of 985 or 986 AD, the sources differ slightly, as they often do. Erik stood on the shore of Iceland and watched people load their lives into ships. 25 ships. That was the fleet that set out from Iceland for Greenland. 25 vessels, carrying somewhere between 400 and 500 people. Men, women, children, thralls, along with cattle, sheep, horses, dogs, tools, timber, seed grain, everything needed to begin a settlement from nothing, on an island at the edge of the navigable world. The North Atlantic in autumn is not kind. The sagas record it plainly, without drama, in the way that Norse writing tends to record catastrophe. Of the 25 ships that left Iceland, only 14 completed the voyage. 11 ships were lost. Some turned back, driven by storms or ice or the simple terror of what lay ahead, and returned to Iceland. Others were not so fortunate. The sea took them. Their names and their people vanish from the record, as the sea has always taken those who underestimated it. But 14 ships arrived. 14 ships, carrying their passengers and livestock and possessions, found their way around the southern cape and up into the green western fjords that Erik had mapped and memorized and named. And there, in those sheltered inlets, the survivors came ashore and began to build. 2 settlements were established, separated by a considerable distance along the western coastline. The Astribig, the eastern settlement, was the larger, located in the fjords of what is now the southernmost part of Greenland. This was where Erik himself settled, on a farm he called Brattahlid, the steep slope. The Vestribig, the western settlement, was smaller and further north, established in a cluster of fjords several hundred miles up the coast. Together, these 2 communities would grow, over the following decades, to a population of perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 people, with hundreds of farms, a dozen or more churches after the conversion to Christianity, and trade connections back to Iceland and Norway that persisted for several centuries. Erik was, by all accounts, the dominant figure of the eastern settlement, its founding father, its most senior chieftain, the man others came to with disputes and decisions. He had arrived in Iceland as a fugitive from Norway. He had left Iceland as an exile. He had returned from the west with a new world to offer, and people had followed him across the North Atlantic in their dozens of ships. He was, in the parlance of a later age, a self-made man. Large and red-haired and difficult and brilliant in the particular way that the great Norse explorers were brilliant, not with books or philosophy, but with the sea, and the cold, and the endless, extraordinary westward reach. He built his farm at Brattahlid. He raised his children there, several sons, and a daughter named Freydis, who would prove as formidable as her father. One of his sons was a young man already showing signs of his father's ability and ambition. His name was Leif Eriksson. And 15 years after the fleet of 25 ships set out from Iceland, Leif would stand on a shore that no European had ever stood on before. A shore that was not Iceland, and not Greenland, but something else entirely. Something further west. Something that would not be found again, not properly, not permanently, for nearly 500 more years. But we are not quite there yet. First, there is another man. A man whose name is less famous than Leif's, but whose claim to priority is, by the strict evidence of the sagas, entirely real. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson, and he found the American continent by accident, some years before Leif went looking for it deliberately. Rest. The night is deep and still. Let the green fjords of Greenland hold you, the cold clear water, the dark rock, the summer grass, the smell of wood smoke from a new longhouse on a new shore. Sleep is very close. Let it come gently. The room is dark and warm. Let your thoughts move slowly now, like water finding its level. There is no hurry. The story will come to you gently, the way all the best stories do, not rushing, not demanding, simply unfolding, one quiet detail at a time. We are in Greenland, now. The settlement is young, perhaps 10 or 15 years old. The longhouses at Brattahlid sit in the shadow of the mountains above the fjord, their turf roofs already softening into the hillside as if they have always been there. Cattle graze on the lower slopes. Children have been born here who have never known another home. Erik the Red, older now but no less commanding, sits at the head of his household in the eastern settlement, the undisputed patriarch of this small, improbable world at the edge of the navigable earth. And the stories are circulating. Stories of what lies further west. They always begin with Bjarni. Let your breathing deepen. In and out. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson, and unlike Erik the Red, who arrived in the historical record trailing fire and blood feud, Bjarni arrives in it quietly, respectably, as a man of business and good standing. He was a merchant trader. He owned his own ship, a considerable mark of substance in the Norse world, and he had spent his adult life making the regular, practical, commercial-minded voyages that kept the Norse world connected. Between Norway and Iceland, Iceland and Norway, carrying goods and news and passengers across the North Atlantic with the reliable competence of a man who understood the sea and respected it. He was not, by any account, a man seeking fame or adventure. He was a man who knew what he was doing and did it well. Each summer, Bjarni sailed. Each winter, he settled at his father's farm, wherever his father was living at the time. It was a rhythm he had kept for years, and it suited him. In the summer of approximately 985 or 986 AD, the same year that Erik the Red's fleet of 25 ships was crossing from Iceland to Greenland, Bjarni completed his voyage from Norway to Iceland and arrived at his father's farm. His father was not there. The farm had been sold. The neighbors told him the news. His father, Herjolf, had decided to go with Erik the Red. He was on a ship somewhere in the North Atlantic, heading for this new land in the west called Greenland, a place Bjarni had never heard of and had no knowledge of whatsoever. The saga records Bjarni's response to this news with an admirable brevity. He was, it tells us, troubled by this turn of events. He had not unloaded his cargo. His crew had not yet gone ashore. And after what the saga implies was a fairly short period of consideration, Bjarni made his decision. He would follow his father. His crew, the saga notes carefully, thought this was unwise. They pointed out, reasonably, that none of them knew the way to Greenland. They did not know the coastline. They did not have the directions. They were proposing to sail into an unknown part of the North Atlantic, in the general direction of west and a little north, hoping to find an island that none of them had ever seen. Bjarni listened to their concerns and then, in the manner of a Norse shipmaster who has already made up his mind, told them they would go regardless. They went. Let the sound of the sea find you now. The creak of timber, the pull of a sail. For the first days, the voyage went well enough. They had wind and direction, and the reasonable confidence of experienced sailors. But then the weather changed. The North Atlantic in autumn is one of the least predictable bodies of water on Earth. Storms build fast and move faster. Fog can drop in minutes, reducing visibility to the length of the ship itself, disorienting even the most experienced navigator who had no compass and no landmarks, only the sun and the stars and the feel of the wind on his face. And for Bjarni's ship, the fog came down and the wind shifted and the days passed, 2 days, 3 days, more, without a glimpse of the sun, without a star at night, with nothing to navigate by and no way of knowing how far they had come or in what direction they had drifted. When the fog finally lifted and the skies cleared, Bjarni's ship was somewhere it had not intended to be, and ahead of them, unmistakable, was land. It was not Greenland. Bjarni looked at it carefully. He was a practical man and a thorough observer, and the saga preserves his observations with the matter-of-fact precision of someone reporting what he actually saw, not embellishing for effect. The land was low-lying. It was heavily forested, trees right down to the water's edge, the kind of dense, dark northern forest the Norse would recognize from their homelands, though different in detail. It was not mountainous. It did not have glacier. It looked, in the words the saga records, like good country, well watered, wooded, gentle in its contours. It was not Greenland. Bjarni knew that much. Greenland, he had been told, had great glacier and ice fields. This land had none of those things. He did not land. This is the moment that history has never quite forgiven him for. His crew wanted to go ashore. They had been at sea for days, disoriented and uncertain, and there was land right there, real land, with trees, possibly with fresh water, solid ground under their feet after weeks of ocean. They asked Bjarni. They perhaps more than asked. He refused. He needed to find his father, he said. This was not Greenland. They would not land. He turned the ship and sailed on, northeast now, following the coastline for a day and a half before turning away from it out to sea again. And then, a second coastline appeared. Rest now. Let the images form gently in the mind's eye. The second land was also forested, also flat and low, at least along the coast that Bjarni could see. His crew asked again to go ashore. Again, Bjarni refused. The saga gives him a line of dialogue here, dry, practical, dismissive in the way that Norse prose is so often dismissive of sentiment. He said this land did not appear to him to be good for much. Whether he meant it, or whether he was simply determined to find his father and not to be distracted, we cannot know. He turned the ship away from the second land and sailed on. 2 days later, the third land appeared. This one was different. It was mountainous, the peaks rising high and stark against the sky, and there were glacier on those peaks, white and cold and unmistakable. It was, in its general appearance, the kind of dramatic, ice-capped terrain that a man told about Greenland might mistake for Greenland. But the shape was wrong. An island, possibly a large one, and forbidding, with no apparent invitation to settle or explore. Bjarni looked at it and shook his head. He said it seemed to him a worthless country, and again, he did not land. He turned the ship northeast, raised his sail to a southwest wind, the right wind, now, the wind he needed, and sailed hard for 4 days. On the 4th day, land appeared ahead of him. And this time, The saga says, the land had glacier, and headlands that matched the description he had been given. It was Greenland. He found the exact headland where his father had settled, a place on the southern tip of Greenland that would come to be called Herjolfsnes, after his father Herjolf. He sailed into the bay and came ashore, and his father was there, standing on the shore of the new world he had come to live in. Bjarni had found Greenland. He had also, on the way, become the first European in recorded history to sight the continent of North America. He had seen it from the deck of his ship on 3 separate occasions. He had noted its character and its forests. And he had sailed away from it without setting foot on shore. He settled in Greenland. He seems to have made at least one more voyage back to Norway in the years that followed. But his great accidental discovery, those 3 wooded, forested, unmountainous coastlines glimpsed through the clearing North Atlantic fog, did not stay quiet. Let your breathing slow now. The night is deep around you. In the close world of the Greenland settlements, stories traveled fast. There were not so many people, perhaps a few hundred families in those early decades, and a story as significant as Bjarni's, a story of unknown land to the southwest, would have moved from farm to farm, from the eastern settlement to the western settlement and back, passing through the long dark winters like a flame passed between candles. And in the great hall at Brattahlid, Erik the Red's sons listened. The saga records, with a particular directness, that Bjarni was criticized. In the Norse world, where curiosity and courage were virtues and the failure to investigate the unknown was a kind of moral failing, Bjarni's decision not to land on those 3 coastlines was held against him. He was a man, his contemporaries felt, who had been given an extraordinary gift, new land, right there, within reach, and had declined to unwrap it. He had prioritized the domestic over the magnificent, the filial over the historic. He had wanted his father, and so he had sailed on past the edge of the known world without even stepping ashore. The criticism stung. And the story was too vivid, and too specific, and too tantalizing to be dismissed or forgotten. Forested land, low and gentle, 2 or 3 days' sail to the southwest. Not ice, not rock, trees and green and the possibility of something more. Leif Eriksson, Erik's eldest son, absorbed all of this. He was, the sagas suggest, very much his father's son in the ways that mattered, physically strong, confident, possessed of the specific Norse courage that was not recklessness but rather a calm and deliberate willingness to go into the unknown. He had made his own voyage to Norway, where he had spent time at the court of King Olaf Tryggvason, and returned to Greenland as a Christian, bringing the new faith back to his mother Theodhild, who built the first Christian church in Greenland, a small turf structure whose remains have been found by archaeologists near Brattahlid. Leif was a man of standing and purpose, and the story of Bjarni's 3 coastlines had been sitting in his mind for years. He went to Bjarni. He bought the ship. The very same ship, that particular vessel, seasoned now and ocean-proven, the ship that had drifted through the fog and found those impossible shores. Leif purchased it outright. He was methodical about the expedition he intended to make. He recruited a crew of 35 men, choosing carefully, looking for sailors and fighters and men with the particular mix of competence and steadiness that a voyage into completely unknown waters would require. He laid in supplies and provisions. And then he went to his father. Whatever else Erik the Red might have been, difficult, violent, exiled twice, the killer of several men, he was the greatest explorer his world had produced. He had sailed to Greenland and named it and colonized it with an act of will and persuasion. He was the right person to lead this next voyage, the logical next step westward. Leif asked him to come. Erik, the saga says, was reluctant at first. He was old now, he said, and less able to endure the hardships of such a voyage than he had once been. But Leif pressed him, and his family pressed him, and in the end Erik agreed. On the morning of departure, he rode down to the shore on horseback to join the ship. On the way, his horse stumbled. Erik fell. He injured his foot. He lay on the ground for a moment, and then he said something that the saga has preserved across 10 centuries, in words that feel entirely real. The words of an old man, injured and tired, who recognizes a sign when he sees one. He said that perhaps this was not meant to be, that he was perhaps not destined to discover any more lands than this one he now lived in. He went home, and Leif Eriksson sailed west alone, with his 35 men and his father's old trading ship, and the directions that Bjarni had brought back, reversed, because now they were following the route backward, toward those 3 coastlines, in the order that Bjarni had seen them last. Rest now. Let the weight of centuries settle gently around you. The story is nearly at its destination. The American continent is close now, just days ahead, through cold grey water and the vast open silence of the North Atlantic. Sleep is close too. Let both come gently. The shore is waiting. The world outside is dark and still. Let your body sink a little deeper into its warmth. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm, like water lapping against the hull of a ship on a calm night. We left Leif Eriksson at the prow of his ship, standing out from the coast of Greenland into the open water of the North Atlantic, 35 men behind him, the wind in the square woolen sail, his father watching from the shore with an injured foot and, perhaps, a complicated mix of pride and longing. The year is approximately 1000 AD, and Leif is sailing west. He has Bjarni's account in his memory, those 3 coastlines, glimpsed in reverse order on the homeward voyage, now to be found again and approached properly this time, in the order they would appear sailing southwest from Greenland. He is, in essence, following a trail of breadcrumbs left by a man who hadn't meant to leave them. The North Atlantic does not care about human intentions. It is wide and cold and indifferent, and crossing it in an open wooden ship requires the full application of everything a Norse sailor knows. Reading the color of the water, the behavior of seabirds, the direction and temperature of the wind, the slow procession of stars at night when the skies are clear. But Leif's crew are experienced men, and the ship is sound, and the voyage, the sagas suggest, was not excessively eventful. The first land appeared. Let your breathing deepen now. It matched what Bjarni had described as his 3rd sighting, the last land he had seen before turning northeast toward Greenland. It was dramatic, in a harsh and inhospitable way. Mountains rose from the water, their upper slopes white with ice, glacier filling the valleys between the peaks. And below the glacier, the lower ground was not forest and not grass but flat stone, great slabs of bare rock stretching to the water's edge, grey and featureless and cold. Leif took his crew ashore. This, already, was more than Bjarni had done. Leif was not a man who would sail past a coastline without at least setting foot on it. They pulled the ship up and walked out onto the rock and looked around them. There was nothing. Rock and ice and silence. Leif made his judgment in the efficient manner of a Norse explorer with more important coastlines waiting further south. He named the place Helgeland, Flat Rock Land, and he returned to the ship. Modern scholars, working from the geography and the direction and distance of the voyage, believe Helgeland was almost certainly what we now call Baffin Island, the vast, largely barren landmass that forms the northeastern shore of Canada, separated from Greenland by the Davis Strait. The glaciated mountains, the flat rock, the latitude, everything fits. Leif sailed on, south and west. 2 days, the saga says. The second land appeared. This one was better. Noticeably, immediately better. The coastline was low and flat, without the dramatic peaks of Helgeland, and it was forested, heavily, densely forested, the dark green of spruce and fir trees running right down to the shore, broken here and there by stretches of white sand beach so pale they gleamed in the grey northern light. Leif and his crew went ashore again, and stood on the beach, and felt the sand under their feet, and looked at the trees. The trees mattered. Timber was one of the scarcest and most valuable resources in both Iceland and Greenland, those treeless islands where every beam and plank for shipbuilding had to be imported, at great expense, from Norway. Here was timber in quantities that a Greenlander could barely imagine. Leif noted it. He named this land Markland, forest land, and he returned to the ship with the pleased, purposeful air of a man who is getting somewhere. Markland is identified by modern scholars as Labrador, the mainland coast of northeastern Canada, heavily forested with boreal forest even today, with the long pale beaches that the saga describes. The distances and directions match. The character of the land matches. But Markland was not the destination. Leif was looking for the land that Bjarni had described first, the most promising of the three, the one furthest along the trail. He turned the ship southwest and sailed on, into a fresh wind, for 2 more days. Rest now. Let the images settle around you, softly. The third land was different from everything that had come before. An island first, lying off the coast, reached by a narrow sound, with dew on the grass that the men bent down to touch and then raised to their lips, and the saga says that the dew tasted sweet to them. That detail has persisted across 1,000 years because it is the kind of detail that is too specific and too sensory to be invented. Men bending down to touch the grass and taste the sweetness of it, the first Europeans to set foot in the New World, and the first thing they noticed was the taste of the dew. Beyond the island, the mainland coast opened into something more sheltered. They found a river, flowing from a lake into the sea, the mouth wide enough for their ship to enter. They rowed in, found the lake, and brought the ship to anchor. They carried their sleeping skins ashore and set up temporary shelters. They looked around them. What they found was extraordinary, measured against anything in their previous experience of northern lands. The grass was rich and green, the kind of grass that Norse farmers measured with an instinctive, experienced eye. The salmon in the river were larger than any they had seen in Greenland or Iceland. The saga notes this specifically, the size of the fish, as something worth recording. The land was gently contoured, without the harsh drama of Helgeland or even Greenland, rolling, soft, approachable. And the winter, when it came, was unlike any winter Leif's Greenland-raised crew had experienced. No frost, or almost none. The grass barely withered. The days were longer, measurably, significantly longer than winter days in Greenland or Iceland. The sun climbed higher in the sky. And here the saga does something remarkable. It records, in the compressed, practical language of Norse prose, an observation about the length of the day that has fascinated scholars for centuries. The saga notes that at the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the sun was still above the horizon at specific points in the Norse daily time reckoning, the Eikttar star and the Dagmala star, which were fixed points in the traditional Norse division of the day based on the sun's position. The scholars who have worked through the mathematics of this observation have calculated that it corresponds to a latitude of somewhere between 49 and 52 degrees north. That is the latitude of Newfoundland. Of the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland, specifically, and as we will discover in a later part of our story, it is precisely there that the physical remains of a Norse settlement have been found. Leif built a camp. Proper structures, timber-framed longhouses, the kind built to last a winter and more, not mere tents or temporary shelters. He called the camp Leifsby, Leif's booths, Leif's camp. The land itself he would give a different name, a name that would echo down through 1,000 years of scholarship and argument. But first, there was Turka. Let your breathing slow now. Let the warmth surround you. Turka was not Norse. He was German, from somewhere in southern Germany or perhaps the German-speaking lands further south, and he had been with Erik the Red's family for as long as Leif could remember. The sagas describe him with an almost fond affection for his hardness. Small, with a high forehead, restless eyes, not much to look at. But he had looked after Leif when Leif was a child, the way that trusted household members did in the Norse world, something between a servant and a guardian, and Leif was fond of him in the straightforward, undemonstrative way that Norse men tended to be fond of people they had known all their lives. One day, as the crew explored the land around the camp, Turka went missing. Leif noticed his absence and, the saga says, was gravely concerned, not calmly concerned, but visibly, genuinely alarmed. Turka had been, in a sense, entrusted to his care by Erik the Red. Leif organized a search party immediately, taking 12 men, and they had not gone far from the camp before they met Turka coming back toward them through the trees. Turka was in a state of considerable excitement. The saga describes the scene with a detail that feels almost comic, though affectionately so. Turka was rolling his eyes and pulling faces and speaking rapidly in German, in the way that the sagas often note of people overwhelmed by strong feeling, reverting to their mother tongue before they have recovered themselves enough to communicate. Leif asked him, with some urgency, what he had found. Turka composed himself, switched to Norse, and told them. He had found vinvir, grapevines, or wild grapes. The saga uses a word that encompasses both the vine and the fruit. He was certain of it, he said, because he had been born in a place where grapes grew, and he knew them when he saw them. Leif's response was entirely practical, and entirely Norse. He ordered the crew to begin gathering the grapes and cutting the vines. They would load them onto the ship as cargo. Alongside timber, great quantities of timber, the most precious commodity they could carry back to treeless Greenland. The vines and the grapes and the timber would fill the ship's hold, and they would take these things back and show them to the world they had come from. And it was the grapes, those wild vines found by a small, excitable German in the forests of an unknown coast, that gave the land its name. Leif called it Vinland, the wine land, or, more precisely, the Vineland, the land where grapes grow wild. The name has generated centuries of scholarly debate, because wild grapes do not grow today as far north as Newfoundland. The climate has shifted over 1,000 years, and what was possible in the warmer centuries of the medieval climate optimum is not possible now. Some scholars have argued that Vinland means not wine grape vines but rather other wild berries, crowberries, perhaps, or red currants, which do grow in Newfoundland. Others have suggested the name could derive from an Old Norse word meaning vin, grassland or pasture, rather than vin, wine. The debate continues. But the oldest and most direct reading of the saga is clear. Turka found grapevines, and Leif named the land for them. Let the quiet of the night settle around you now. The winter at Leifsby passed gently, mild, green, abundant. The salmon in the river, the sweet grass, the long soft evenings of a latitude well south of anything the crew had previously wintered in. There was no great drama in that winter. The sagas do not record conflict or catastrophe, and their silence on the subject of hardship is itself a kind of testimony. It was, by Norse standards, a good winter. In the spring, Leif loaded the ship with its cargo of timber and dried grapes and vinewood and began the voyage home to Greenland. The homeward journey brought one more event worth noting, one more thread in the tapestry of a life that was, by any measure, already remarkable. Sailing back northeast toward Greenland, Leif's crew sighted something on a reef. A ship, or the wreck of one. And on the reef with the wreck, stranded, were people. Norse people. A crew that had been shipwrecked and was waiting, with the particular patient desperation of sailors who know the sea and know their situation, for someone to find them. Leif found them. He brought them off the reef, took them aboard his already heavily laden ship, and returned them safely to Greenland. It was, by Norse reckoning, an act of considerable seamanship and generosity, and it earned Leif a second name, a name to set beside the one his father bore. Erik had been Erik the Red. His son, from this voyage onward, was called Leif in Hepney, Leif the Lucky. He arrived back in Greenland with his rescued sailors and his cargo of timber and his dried vines and the story of Vinland, gentle, warm, green Vinland, with its sweet grass and its enormous salmon and its wild grapes and its mild winters and its long, measurable summer days. And in the settlements of Greenland, in the long houses and the farm kitchens and the great hall at Brattahlid, people listened. Erik the Red listened. His children listened. His neighbors and his rivals and the farmers of the western settlement listened. The story passed outward from Leif's return like a stone dropped in still water. There was land to the southwest. Real land. Good land. Land with timber and food and warmth. Land with a winter you could survive without frost blackening your fingers. Land with salmon larger than any you had seen. Land where grapevines grew wild in the forest, and a small German man had rolled his eyes and spoken in his mother tongue just from the joy of recognizing something familiar so far from home. Vinland. Leif would not go back. He had inherited Brattahlid from his father. Erik the Red died not long after Leif's return, of an epidemic that swept the settlement, and a chieftain did not leave his people to go exploring. He had done what he had done, and it was done. But others were listening, and others would go. Rest now. Let the word settle softly in your mind. Vinland. The Vineland. The Greenland. The land at the western edge of everything the Norse knew. Sleep is very close now. Let it come. Let the story carry you gently forward into the dark. The room is quiet. The night is deep. Let your breathing find its slow, easy pace. There is nothing to hold on to tonight, nothing to carry. Only this, a story reaching its most vivid and human passage, the part where the world the Norse had found began to push back. We are in Greenland. Leif Eriksson is home at Brattahlid, the great farm above the fjord, its turf longhouse solid and familiar after the strange mild winter of Vinland. He has brought back timber and dried vines and a story that will not be put to rest. His father Erik is gone now, dead of the illness that swept the settlement not long after Leif's return, and Leif is the head of the household, the chieftain, the man others look to. He will not go back to Vinland himself. But the story he has brought back is alive in every conversation, around every fire, in every household of the settlement. And the first person who could not leave it alone was his brother. Let your body grow heavy now, comfortable and still. Thorvald Eriksson was Erik's second son, and where Leif was measured and fortunate, Thorvald seems to have been something more purely restless, a man drawn to the thing itself rather than its practical value, to the beauty of new country for its own sake. He went to Leif and asked permission to use the camp at Leifsby and to take the ship that had made the voyage. Leif agreed. He lent his brother the camp, the ship, everything needed. He had no objection to Vinland being explored further. He simply would not go himself. Thorvald sailed in approximately 1004 AD with a crew of 30 men. They found Leifsby as Leif had left it, the timber-framed longhouses standing, the camp usable and sound. They settled in for the winter, fishing and gathering and resting, as any sensible Norse crew would do, conserving their energy for the exploring season ahead. When spring came, Thorvald divided his crew and sent a party of men in the ship's boat to explore the coastline to the west and south, while he remained at the camp with the main body of men. What those explorers found, as they worked along the coast, was consistent with everything Leif had described. Beautiful country. The word the saga uses, faggot, appears more than once in connection with Vinland, a word meaning fair or lovely, the kind of word that Norse prose, which tends toward the sparse and functional, does not use carelessly. Forested hills, sandy beaches, rivers, green meadows running down to the water, and, as far as they could see, no people. They came back and reported. The country was good. They had found no sign of habitation. They had looked in the wrong places. The following summer, Thorvald took the ship and sailed to the east, exploring a different stretch of coastline, and on a forested headland that he found particularly beautiful. One of those places that simply arrests a person, that makes them stop and look and feel the particular ache of a landscape that seems made for human habitation. Thorvald said something that the saga preserves with quiet simplicity. He said that here was a fair place, and here he should like to make his home. He would not get the chance. Let your breathing slow now. Let the images come gently. Under the forest edge, pulled up on the beach, they found 3 skin-covered humps. Canoes, or the Norse equivalent of what they understood canoes to be, inverted on the sand, and under each canoe, sleeping, 3 men. 9 men in total. Indigenous people of the North American coast, sleeping on a beach on a summer morning, with no warning and no reason to expect what was about to happen to them. Thorvald's men killed 8 of them. 1 escaped, pushing his canoe into the water and paddling away with a speed born of terror. It is one of those moments in the Norse sagas where the text simply states what happened, without comment or judgment, in the flat declarative style that Norse prose uses for everything from a pleasant fishing trip to a massacre. The moral weight of it falls on the modern reader, not on the saga's narrator. 8 men killed. 1 escaped. Thorvald's crew went back to the ship. They did not have to wait long for the consequence. From around a headland, a fleet of skin boats appeared. Many boats, the saga says more than Thorvald's men could count, paddling hard, the men in them armed. They came in toward the ship and the air filled with arrows. Thorvald's crew raised their shields, those round painted shields that hung along the ship's rail, and crouched behind them, and the arrows thudded into wood and leather and the timber of the hull. And for a time it seemed they might hold. The attackers eventually withdrew, and the sounds of paddling faded, and the men looked at each other with the particular relief of people who have survived something that might easily have gone the other way. And then Thorvald looked down. He had been struck. An arrow had found the gap between his shield and the side of the ship, that narrow, unprotected space under his arm, and it had gone in deep. He knew, with the instinctive knowledge of a man who had seen wounds before, what it meant. He pulled the arrow out himself. He looked at it, the saga says, and then he spoke. He said, "There is fat around my belly. We have won a fine and fruitful country, but we shall not be able to enjoy it." It is one of the great lines of the Norse sagas, that dry, unsentimental acknowledgement of death in the same breath as an appreciation of the country that was killing him. Thorvald Eriksson, second son of Erik the Red, dying on a North American beach with an arrow in his side, and what he noticed was that the land was worth having. He asked his men to bury him on the headland he had admired, the beautiful one, where he had said he would like to make his home. He asked them to place crosses at his head and his feet. He had been raised Norse pagan, as all Erik's children had been, but the new faith had reached Greenland with Leif, and Thorvald died a Christian, or near enough to one, asking for the Christian markers over his grave. His men buried him there. They called the headland Crossanes, Cross Cape. Thorvald Eriksson became the first known European to die on North American soil. His grave is somewhere on the northeastern coast of Canada, unmarked now, long reclaimed by the forest and the years. His crew sailed back to Greenland and told their story. Rest now. The night holds you gently. And still, the story of Vinland would not rest. Into the world of the Greenland settlements, a few years after Thorvald's death, came a man of a different kind. His name was Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelander, a merchant of considerable wealth and reputation, a man the sagas describe with the particular approval they reserved for people who were both capable and well-connected. He had sailed to Greenland on a trading voyage and had been welcomed at Brattahlid by Leif Eriksson himself. And at Brattahlid, Karlsefni met a woman named Gudrid. Gudrid Thorbjarnadottir is one of the most remarkable figures in the Norse sagas, a woman whose life traced an arc of extraordinary breadth, from Iceland to Greenland to North America and eventually to Rome. She had been married to Leif's brother Thorstein, who had died in the epidemic that also took Erik the Red, and she was widowed now, living at Brattahlid under Leif's household. She was, by all accounts, a woman of intelligence and presence and considerable personal force. Karlsefni married her, and Gudrid, who had listened to every story of Vinland that had passed through Brattahlid, who had lived in the household of the man who had found it, who knew the sagas of Thorvald's death and the beauty of the country and the timber and the salmon and the grapes, Gudrid wanted to go. The expedition that Karlsefni organized was of a different order entirely from the voyages that had gone before. This was not exploration. This was colonization. 3 ships. Approximately 160 people, men and women both, which was the key distinction, the thing that separated a settlement attempt from a raiding party. Livestock, cattle, sheep, supplies for a long stay. The full apparatus of a Norse farm in miniature, carried across the North Atlantic with the intention of planting it in Vinland and making it grow. They sailed in approximately 1010 AD, following the now familiar route southwest, finding Helgeland and Markland in their expected places, and eventually reaching Vinland, the same gentle, forested, salmon-rich country that Leif had found and named. They made for Leifsby, the camp Leif had built, and settled in. Let your thoughts drift now, like leaves on slow water. For a time, it seemed to work. The land was everything the stories had promised. The grass was rich, the fishing was extraordinary, the cattle found good grazing. The first winter was manageable, harder than Leif had described, with frost and snow, but survivable. The settlement had the feel of something that might last. And the Skraelings came. Not in war, this first time. They came out of the forest cautiously. The saga describes them emerging from the trees, looking at everything with the careful attention of people who are trying to understand what they are seeing. And Karlsefni made a decision that was, in the circumstances, a reasonable one. He ordered his men to put down their weapons and to bring out goods for trading. What followed was a trade, of a kind. The Skraelings wanted the red cloth the Norse had brought. They valued it greatly, wrapping strips of it around their heads. In exchange they offered furs, grey and black and rich, the pelts of animals the Norse had never seen. The saga notes that Karlsefni set a limit on the size of the cloth strips he would trade. As the Skraelings' demand grew, he cut the cloth into smaller and smaller pieces, so that a finger width of red cloth was eventually enough to buy a full fur. It was trade at its most basic and its most unequal. But for a time, it was trade. And in the midst of this improbable colony at the edge of the Norse world, something happened that the sagas record with the simplest possible language, and which carries an extraordinary weight across 1,000 years. Gudrid gave birth to a son. She named him Snorri. Snorri Karlsefni, son of Thorfinn and Gudrid, born at Leifsby in approximately the year 1005 AD, or perhaps a little later, the sources differ slightly. He is believed to be the first European child born in North America. He grew up, eventually, in Iceland. His descendants, traced through the careful genealogies of the Icelandic sagas, include several bishops of the medieval Icelandic Church. His mother Gudrid, after returning from Vinland, eventually made a pilgrimage to Rome, one of the most traveled women of the medieval age. But his birth at Leifsby is a fact that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. A child, born in the New World, in a turf longhouse on a shore the rest of humanity would not reach again for nearly 500 years. Rest now. Let your breathing deepen. The trouble, when it came from the same direction as it always had. The trading relationship with the Skraelings soured. The sagas are not entirely consistent on the details. The two sagas tell slightly different versions of what went wrong, but the broad shape of events is clear. The Norse had something the Skraelings desperately wanted, and they would not trade it. Not the red cloth this time. The Skraelings wanted weapons. Iron. The sharp, hard, inexplicable metal that the Norse worked so easily and the people of North America at this time did not possess. Karlsefni refused. He would not trade weapons to people who might use them against his own settlement. And so the relationship that had been tense became hostile. The Skraelings came in larger numbers. They came in the great fleet of skin boats that the Norse found so unnerving. Dozens, scores of them, the sound of their battle cries carrying across the water, and they attacked. The Norse fought back. They were better armed, individually, and the sagas suggest that in the hand-to-hand fighting they could hold their own. But they were vastly outnumbered, and the Skraelings kept coming, and there was a moment, the sagas record it in both versions, when the Norse line wavered and began to fall back through the trees toward the shore. It was at this moment that Freydis appeared. Freydis Eriksdottir, Erik the Red's daughter. She was pregnant, the saga says, heavily pregnant, moving slowly. She came out of the longhouse and saw the Norse men retreating, and she was, by every account, furious. She called out to them, The saga gives her words, sharp and contemptuous, something to the effect that she wondered how men of their kind could run from such opponents. She picked up a sword from beside a fallen Norse man, and then, facing the advancing Skraelings, she pulled open her shirt and drew the flat of the blade across her bare breast. The Skraelings stopped. The saga says simply that they were frightened by this, and retreated. Whether it was the specific action, or the totality of what they were seeing, this large, furious, pregnant Norse woman standing her ground alone where the men had fled, is impossible to say across 1,000 years. But the Skraelings withdrew. Freydis, daughter of Erik the Red, had inherited something of her father. But the respite was temporary. Karlsefni was a practical man, a merchant, a planner, a person who assessed situations clearly. The land was rich. The land was everything the sagas had promised. But the people who already lived here were not few, and they were not going away, and the Norse settlement of 160 people was not large enough to hold its ground against sustained opposition over the long term. After approximately 3 years in Vinland, Karlsefni made his decision. They would go back to Greenland. The sagas record this without tragedy, without the sense of defeat that a later age might attach to it. It was a practical judgment. The country was good, but the conditions were not right. They loaded their ships with everything they had brought and everything they had gathered: timber, furs, the dried grapes, the memory of the place. They sailed northeast, back toward Greenland, back toward the world they had come from. The Norse settlement of North America was over. It had lasted, in total, perhaps 3 years of active habitation. It had produced 1 child born on North American soil, 1 death on North American soil, 1 extraordinary act of courage by a pregnant woman with a sword, and the most extraordinary geographical achievement of the medieval world. They had been there. They had found it, crossed to it, wintered in it, traded in it, fought in it, been born and died in it. And then they had gone home. Rest now. Let the weight of it settle. A continent, glimpsed and touched and then released. The night is deep and still around you. Sleep is very close now. Let it come gently, like a ship finding harbor after a long crossing. The night is at its deepest now. Let everything go quiet. Let the breath move slowly, like the tide, like the long slow breathing of the sea that has carried this story from its beginning. We have come a long way together. From the grey pebble beaches of Norway, where longships were pulled up on shore with their carved dragon prows and their round shields hanging along the rail. Through the fog and storms of the North Atlantic, following a chain of westward voyages, each one reaching a little further than the last, each one building on the knowledge and the courage of the one before. Through Iceland, with its smoking springs and its parliament on the rift between 2 worlds. Through Greenland's green fjords and the extraordinary colonizing will of a red-haired exile who named a frozen island after its most appealing feature. Through the accidental sightings of Jarni Herjolfsson, the deliberate expedition of Leif Eriksson, the death of Thorvald on a North American beach, the birth of a child named Snorri at the edge of the known world, the retreating figures of Karlsefni's colonists sailing back northeast with their timber and their furs and their complicated memories. We have arrived, now, at the final part of the story, the part where the ground itself speaks. Let your body grow heavy and still. After Karlsefni's colonists returned to Greenland, the voyages to Vinland did not entirely cease. The sagas record one more expedition, a troubled and violent one led by Freydis herself, which ended badly and is a story for another night. But the sustained attempt at settlement was over, and in the centuries that followed, Vinland receded from the practical world of the Norse and into the world of story and record. The Greenland settlements themselves endured, with remarkable tenacity, for nearly 500 years. The eastern settlement, Erik settlement, the one he had built at Brattahlid, survived the longest, its farms and churches and small community of Norse Greenlanders persisting through the gradual cooling of the climate, the increasing isolation from Norway and Iceland, the growing pressure from the Inuit people moving southward, until sometime around the middle of the 15th century. The last written record of the eastern settlement is a document from 1408, recording a wedding held in the church at Hvalsey, an ordinary human moment, a marriage, in what was by then one of the most remote Norse communities on earth. After that, silence. When European ships eventually reached Greenland again, in the 16th century, they found empty farms and abandoned churches and the slow return of the land to grass and silence. But before the Greenland settlements faded, the monks and scholars of Iceland and Greenland had written down the sagas. The Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Erik the Red, those two imperfect, sometimes contradictory, always vivid accounts of the westward voyages, were committed to vellum, preserved in the great tradition of Icelandic literacy, copied and recopied through the centuries. They sat in libraries and collections, read by scholars, puzzling to historians who were not quite sure what to make of them. Because for a very long time, the sagas were all there was. No physical evidence, no ruins, no artifacts, just the stories. And stories, without proof, are not quite history. Rest now. Let the quiet of the night hold you. The man who decided to go looking for the proof was named Helge Ingstad. He was Norwegian, an explorer of the old school, a man who had lived among the Inuit of Arctic Canada and written books about remote places and wild landscapes, a man for whom the idea of following a medieval saga across the North Atlantic in search of a lost settlement was not eccentric but simply the next interesting thing to do. His wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, was an archaeologist, the rigorous, methodical complement to Helge's exploring instincts. Together, from the mid-1950s onward, they worked through the sagas with systematic care, trying to reconcile the geographical descriptions, the distances, the directions, the landmarks, the latitude observations, with the actual coastline of northeastern North America. The sagas said Vinland was southwest of Markland, which was southwest of Helgeland. The latitudinal observation suggested somewhere around 50 degrees north. The description of the land, forested, gentle, with a river running from a lake, pointed toward the northeastern tip of Newfoundland, where the island reaches out toward the open Atlantic like a hand extended westward. Helge Ingstad worked his way down the coast systematically, stopping at settlements and fishing villages, asking a simple question. Had anyone seen, anywhere nearby, old ruins that didn't belong to any known European settlement? In 1960, he arrived at a small fishing village on the very northern tip of Newfoundland. The village was called Lance Auxiliary Meadows, a French approximation of an earlier name, possibly Lance Auxiliary Medicis, the Bay of Jellyfish, though no one was entirely certain of the etymology anymore. It was a quiet, wind-swept place, a curve of shore on the Strait of Belle Isle, the narrow channel between Newfoundland and Labrador. A local fisherman named George Decker offered to show Ingstad something. He led him to a series of low, grass-covered mounds on the terrace above the shore. He called them, with the pragmatic inexactitude of a man who had lived beside them all his life without thinking much about them, the old Indian camp. Helge Ingstad looked at the mounds. He had seen enough Norse sites in Iceland and Greenland to recognize what he was looking at. He said, "These are not Indian. Let your breathing slow now, deep and easy." The excavations began in 1961 and continued for 7 years, directed by and Stein Ingstad with the meticulous care of a trained archaeologist who understood the weight of what she was uncovering. What emerged from beneath the grass of that Newfoundland terrace was extraordinary. 8 distinct structures, the outlines of buildings, their walls collapsed and their roofs long gone, but their footprints clear in the earth. Turf construction, walls built from cut blocks of sod, in the specific technique used in Norse buildings in Iceland and Greenland and nowhere else in the Americas. The floor plans matched Norse longhouse designs precisely. The long central hearth, the raised sleeping platforms along the walls, the separate small rooms at each end. These were not structures that resembled Norse buildings in a general way. They were Norse buildings, built by people who knew how Norse buildings were made. Among the artifacts recovered from the site were 2 objects of particular significance. The first was a bronze ring-headed pin, a cloak fastener of a type used in Norse and Norse-Irish contexts in the 10th and 11th centuries, found in no other cultural tradition in North America. The second was a soapstone spindle whorl, a small, perforated disc used for spinning wool. Spindle whorls are women's tools. Their presence at the site meant that women had been here, which meant this was a settlement, not merely a temporary exploratory camp of men, but a place where people of both sexes had lived and worked. A soapstone spindle whorl. A woman spinning wool, on the coast of Newfoundland, 1,000 years ago. The carbon dating results, when they came back from the laboratory, were unambiguous. The organic material from the site, charcoal, wood, peat, dated consistently to approximately 1000 AD. The margin of error placed the occupation of the site squarely within the period described in the sagas, within the lifetime of Leif Eriksson himself. The sagas were not legend. They were history. In 1978, Lance Auxiliary Meadows was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the first such designations in the world. It is the only confirmed Norse site in North America, and it is now understood by archaeologists to represent not Vinland itself, the land of grapes, but rather a base camp, a staging post from which Norse sailors explored further south along the coast. Vinland proper, with its wild grapes and its milder winters, was almost certainly further south, perhaps as far as the Gulf of St. Lawrence, perhaps further still. The butternuts found at Lance Auxiliary Meadows, a tree whose range does not extend as far north as Newfoundland, confirm that the Norse were traveling south of the site, into regions where such trees grew, and bringing back what they found. The full extent of Norse exploration along the North American coast remains uncertain. But Lance Auxiliary Meadows is the anchor point, the fixed star by which everything else is navigated. They were here. The ground says so. Let the quiet of the night deepen around you. In 1965, Yale University made an announcement that sent a ripple of excitement through the academic world. They possessed, Yale scholars said, a medieval map. It was drawn on vellum, in the style of 15th century cartographic documents, and it showed what medieval maps typically showed: the outlines of Europe, the British Isles, Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and there, to the west of Greenland, a large island shape, carefully outlined, with a Latin inscription identifying it as Vinlanda Insula, the island of Vinland, and noting that it had been discovered by Bjarni and Leif in company. The Vinland map, as it immediately became known, was stunning. If genuine, it was the earliest cartographic representation of the American continent in existence, a medieval European map showing a landmass in the western Atlantic, drawn before Columbus was born. The scholarly excitement was considerable. The map was published in a major volume by Yale University Press. Newspapers around the world reported it. For a time, it seemed to be the definitive documentary proof, in addition to the physical evidence at Lance Auxiliary Meadows, of the Norse discovery of America. And then the chemists got involved. Analysis of the ink on the map, conducted first in the 1970s, and subsequently refined with increasingly sophisticated techniques in the decades that followed, produced results that troubled the map's supporters deeply. The ink contained a compound called anatase titanium dioxide in a form that, the analysts argued, was not produced until the 20th century. The implication was stark. The Vinland map was not a 15th century document. It was a modern forgery. The debate has never been fully resolved. Supporters of the map's authenticity have challenged the chemical analysis, arguing that naturally occurring anatase can be found in medieval inks and that the testing methods were flawed. Opponents maintain that the evidence of forgery is overwhelming. Yale University itself has oscillated in its position over the decades, at various points describing the map as probably genuine, probably a forgery, and, most recently, as a matter still under investigation. The Vinland map remains, to this day, one of the most contested documents in the history of cartography, simultaneously one of the most potentially significant and one of the most thoroughly disputed objects in any archive in the world. But here is what matters. The Vinland map was never the proof. The proof was already in the ground at Lance Auxiliary Meadows, in the soapstone spindle whorl and the bronze pin and the Norse longhouse footprints and the carbon dates reading 1000 AD. The proof was in the sagas themselves, those two imperfect, vivid, humanly specific documents that describe distances and directions and latitudes and landmarks with the grounded precision of people who had been there and were trying to tell you truthfully what they had seen. The proof was in the butternuts, carried north from forests further south. The proof was in a fisherman named George Decker leading a Norwegian explorer to a set of grassy mounds on a Newfoundland shore and calling them the Old Indian Camp. The Vinland map, genuine or forged, changes nothing that matters. Rest now. We are nearly home. Let your breathing find its deepest, slowest rhythm. What Leif Eriksson achieved, in the year 1000 AD, is beyond serious scholarly dispute. He led an expedition from Greenland, across the Labrador Sea, and landed on the northeastern coast of North America. He built a camp there. He wintered there. He observed the length of the days with enough precision that we can calculate his approximate latitude. He found wild grapes, and named the land for them. He brought timber and vines back to Greenland and told his story. He was not the first to sight the continent. Bjarni Herjolfsson had done that, from the deck of his ship, a generation earlier. But he was the first to set foot on it, the first to explore it, the first to winter there, the first to describe it in enough detail that people who came after him could follow his directions and find it again. He did this nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492. Columbus, for his part, reached the Caribbean, the islands of the Bahamas and Cuba and Hispaniola, without ever setting foot on the North American mainland at all. The Norse had stood on that mainland 5 centuries earlier. In the United States, October the 9th is recognized as Leif Eriksson Day, a designation established by Congress and signed into law in 1964. It falls the day before Columbus Day, a proximity that is either diplomatically considered or mildly pointed, depending on your perspective. Statues of Leif Eriksson stand in several American cities. In Boston, in Milwaukee, in Seattle, in Trondheim in Norway, and in Reykjavik in Iceland. He is claimed by Norwegians and Icelanders and by the descendants of the Norse diaspora across the world. But perhaps what matters most is not the claim, or the priority, or the question of who got there first in the long human competition to find and name and possess every piece of land on Earth. What matters is the chain. The extraordinary, improbable, thousand-year chain of westward voyages that began with Harald Fairhair unifying Norway and driving proud chieftains into the Atlantic. That carried Ingolfur Arnason to Iceland, following his carved wooden pillars through the steam. That gave Erik the Red 3 years of exile and the specific, magnificent stubbornness to use them for exploration rather than endurance. That put Bjarni Herjolfsson in the wrong place at the right time, and gave him eyes clear enough to see what he was looking at even if he lacked the courage to go ashore. That sent Leif Eriksson westward in his father's traded ship with 35 men and the reverse directions of an accidental voyage, until a German foster father rolled his eyes and spoke in his mother tongue, and a new land got its name from the thing that had surprised him most. That chain of voyages, from Norway to the Faroes to Iceland to Greenland to North America, each link forged by a specific person making a specific decision in specific weather on a specific day, is one of the great navigational achievements in human history. Made without compass, without chart, without the accumulated cartographic knowledge of the Mediterranean maritime tradition. Made in open wooden ships, with woolen sails and iron oars and carved dragon prows. Made by people who believed the sea was full of spirits, and crossed it anyway. The sagas that preserve this story are among the great literary achievements of medieval Europe. Spare, human, morally complex documents that read, even in translation, with the weight of things that actually happened. They were written in Iceland, by Icelanders who understood that the past was worth preserving, that the stories of what people did and where they went and what they found were worth the labor of setting down on vellum and keeping safe through the centuries. They kept them safe. The stories survived. And the ground at Lance Auxiliary Meadows confirmed what the stories always said. The Norsemen came to North America. They stood on the shore. They tasted the dew on the grass, and it was sweet. Let that image hold you now, as sleep comes. Ashore in the early morning, cold clean air, the sound of a river running to the sea, the smell of forest and salt, and the particular smell of a new place, a place no one you have ever known has ever been, a place without a name yet, waiting at the edge of the world for someone to arrive and stand on it and look around and decide what to call it. Tall men in wool and iron, stepping off the prow of a longship into the shallow water of a Newfoundland beach, looking west, into a continent that goes on forever, not knowing that, not knowing what is there, only knowing that it is beautiful and real and theirs to explore. Let that shore be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. The Greenland, the Vineland, Vinland. Sleep well.